Chapter 4, The Crying Game. Oh my God, what have I done? I was lying in bed the next morning with a bad case of candidate's remorse. They're going to destroy me. People are going to see my name on the ballot and are going to laugh at me. Who the hell does he think he is? I was sure I would hear, only this time it wouldn't just be a voice inside my head. But I'd forgotten how nice, how kind, and how polite the people of Louisville really are. One evening just after Carolyn and I arrived back home after a long stint in Montreal, where people drive like NASCAR veterans and Canadian politeness gets crushed under their tires, we were traveling on a quiet street in downtown Louisville. There was only one other car near us and its headlights began to flash. The driver's side window lowered and I could see a woman's hand waving at us. "What the hell does she want?" I grumbled to Carolyn. The car pulled up next to us. "Yes?" I asked the driver. "I'm so sorry," the woman answered in a lilting southern accent. "I was afraid that I'd cut you off back there, and I just wanted to apologize." I looked at Carolyn. She looked at me, wide-eyed. "Can you believe that?" I asked her. "Nope," she answered. But this was Louisville, where people will mumble sorry if they even come close to violating your personal space, where they'll make eye contact and smile a hello when you pass them on the sidewalk. Adults will, at least. Where they'll whisper "excuse me" at the grocery store if they have to squeeze down the aisle between you and the canned beans you're looking at. Where if you honk at a driver, they'll look at you like they've just been shot. After the filing deadline passed, I hunted down the finalized Kentucky primary ballot. Under the KY3 race, there were 4 names: mine, Andrew Horn, Burl Charles Farnsley, and John Yarmouth. Shit. Yarmouth. This race is over, I said to myself. Yarmouth had been making noise that he might run, but when January 30th came and he hadn't yet filed, I figured that he decided not to. And that was my first lesson in how the game is played, in congressional politics at least. If you're a newbie and there's no incumbent in your primary, you hang back and wait until the last hour before you file. Size up the other candidates first. If you don't like what you see, wait for the next cycle. 2 years go by in a hurry. John Yarmouth was well known around town, probably as well known as the Bambi Bar. His father was a very successful businessman, and his family made millions running a chain of barbecue joints all across the South. Yarmouth had founded and run 2 local publications, Louisville Today magazine and an underground newspaper called Leo, the Louisville Eccentric Observer. One of Yarmouth's Leo partners was Denny Crum, and he sat next to the now retired coach at University of Louisville basketball games. Yarmouth had never held office before. He'd run in a couple of local races, but he'd lost both times. Once upon a time, he'd been a Republican, and he'd even worked with Mitch McConnell. They'd both been assistants for Marlowe Cook, a moderate Republican senator who'd succeeded Thurston Morton in 1968. By 2006, Yarmouth had morphed into a Democrat, and he had his mitts in all kinds of local pies. No amount of airtime on CNN was going to give Andrew Horn the kind of name recognition that Yarmouth had. No amount of anything was going to give it to me. I didn't know the 4th guy on the ballot, Burl Farnsley, but I certainly knew of his family. He was the son of Charlie Farnsley, the popular former mayor who'd run Gene Snyder out of town when he took his congressional seat in 1964. The Farnsley name was also well known, and the family had been around town forever. They were old school Louisville. The first time we were all scheduled to meet was at a candidate forum run by a group called Democracy for America. The head of the group, Mike Bailey, was a transplant to Louisville from Rapid City, South Dakota. He'd never been involved in politics either, he told me, until 2004 when he'd gotten pissed off like I had. We met at a local library, and the group called candidates one at a time into a small room so that they could ask us questions. I spent a lot of time milling around in the hallway talking to the other guys. Burl Farnsley wasn't there, but Andrew Horn and John Yarmouth were, and they were as nice and as respectful and as kind as can be. It didn't feel at all as though we were rivals, probably because we weren't really. Yarmouth was going to win this race, and I think that everybody knew it, and the rest of us were just there to put on a good show. But we were also allies in a common cause. I spent a long time talking to Brooke Pardue, who I'd gotten to know when I started hanging out at Louisville Metro Democratic Club meetings. She was the club's president, but she'd taken a leave of absence to work for Andrew Horn. I told her that I felt a bit foolish for filing and that I probably should have talked to her about it first. Nonsense, she told me. She had nothing but encouraging words. And then she told me the story of Burl Farnsley. Like his father, Burl was brilliant and well-liked. I found out much later that he was good buddies with our friends Terry and Martha. They were all members of Calvary Episcopal, a big church in downtown Louisville. Terry was Burl's lawyer. Those kinds of coincidences are typical of city towns like Louisville. If you get to know someone, chances are good that they know someone who you also know through an entirely different connection. Terry and Martha both told me how brilliant Burl was. Brooke told me that Burl was studying law at the University of Louisville when some men broke into his apartment, apparently just to rob the place. He was living in Old Louisville, not far from the university campus. It was where some of Louisville's wealthiest families lived at the start of the 20th century in big, beautiful old brownstones. But by the 1960s, crime in the area had become a serious problem. It still is. During the robbery, Burl was savagely beaten, and he suffered traumatic injuries and permanent cognitive issues as a result. He had to drop out of law school, and he was dependent on a family trust to take care of him. He couldn't work, but whenever a mayoral or congressional election rolled around, he always filed to run. He wanted to do what his dad had done. After the forum, the Democracy for America group endorsed Andrew Horn. Something about watching him win that round and something about Burl's story motivated and saddened me at the same time. Poor Burl. With his talent and pedigree, he should have been a congressman long ago, or a mayor, or whatever he wanted to be. Now he was just one of the other guys in a sideshow like me. And I'd paid my $500, damn it, and I might as well give this thing the old college try. I needed to think about fundraising. I needed bumper stickers and yard signs. I needed a campaign slogan, maybe a campaign manager. And I'd need to bone up on issues, especially local issues. I was a news junkie, but it's one thing to be the student of a subject, and it's something else entirely to be a teacher of it. I realized that I didn't know enough about the things that were going on in my hometown. I needed to change that in a hurry. It was a Wednesday, the 6th of April, 1960. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was in a meeting with some of his top advisors, and he wasn't happy. The group was discussing plans for the interstate highway system that would someday bear his name. But in that Wednesday meeting, Eisenhower complained that no one had told him that the planned network of highways would plow directly through the cities it was designed to connect. It was not what he wanted, he said. He'd reviewed the plans, but only in a hands-off kind of a way, and he never anticipated that the program would turn out like this. And now it was too late to change any of it. The desire to build high-speed, limited-access highways was certainly nothing new. It was the Nazis, ironically, who pioneered their construction during the 1930s when they developed the beginnings of Germany's Autobahn system. The Nazis were evil, but they weren't stupid, and they were pretty good urban planners. They knew that cities were places to drive to, not drive through. The idea of tearing up large swaths of valuable urban land just to accommodate high-speed auto traffic was anathema to their grandiose designs. But many people in post-war America thought differently. They worried that if cities were bypassed by their highways, local commerce would suffer. It was a fundamental flaw in thinking that would change the face of cities all across the United States. It certainly changed the face of Louisville. One of the earliest interstate construction projects was I-65, a major north-south corridor that connects the Great Lakes region to the Gulf Coast. Some highway projects that were intended to run through cities met with resistance, but few opposed the plans for I-65, and some even encouraged it. I-65 starts just south of Chicago near Gary, Indiana, and it runs directly through Indianapolis on the way to its terminus in Mobile, Alabama. It also runs directly through Louisville. Henry Ward, who was a member of the Louisville Chamber of Commerce and who would later become Kentucky's highway commissioner, was one of the people who lobbied hard for I-65 to be routed through downtown Louisville. When it was completed in 1963, the elevated highway crossed the Ohio River and then curved right through the heart of the city. After JFK died, the I-65 bridge across the Ohio was named for him. The new interstate created inhumane dead zones in parts of central Louisville's most established neighborhoods, including Old Louisville where Burl had lived. In his old age, Henry Ward realized the mistake that he'd made, but of course by then it was far too late to do anything about it. After I-65 came I-71, which starts in Louisville and ends near Cleveland, passing through Cincinnati and Columbus along the way. In the 1970s came I-64, which runs from the Atlantic coast near Chesapeake, Virginia to the outskirts of St. Louis. As it passes through Louisville, I-64 snakes its way along the banks of the Ohio River, where it separates the city from most of its riverfront. When the 9th Street overpass in downtown Louisville was finished in December of 1976, I-64 was complete, and so was the isolation of the city from its river. The confluence of the three interstates near downtown Louisville was not well designed, and the resultant ugly mess of an interchange became known as Spaghetti Junction. Its real name was the Kennedy Interchange. By the mid-1960s, pretty much everything in the United States was being named after John F. Kennedy. Louisville's interstate mess is webbed together by a pair of concentric ring roads. The inner ring is I-264, the Watterson Expressway, and the outer ring is, of course, I-265, the Gene Snyder Freeway. I-264 was first built in the 1960s and was named for Henry Watterson, a one-time congressman and Confederate soldier who, after the Civil War, became the editor and part owner of the Courier-Journal. I-265 was completed in 1987, but even Gene Snyder's six-lane ego couldn't connect its Kentucky and Indiana sections. In the northeastern corner of Metro Louisville, I-265 ended abruptly, well short of the Ohio River and just south of Prospect, Kentucky, another one of Louisville's many city-within-the-city enclaves. Only this enclave was inhabited by some of Louisville's wealthiest citizens, including John Yarmouth. In 2002, the governors of Kentucky and Indiana announced plans for a project that would clean up the mess that was Spaghetti Junction and finally build the bridge over the Ohio River that I-265 needed. But there would be another bridge. A second downtown Louisville bridge would also be built to handle 6 lanes of northbound I-65 traffic, and the old Kennedy Bridge would be converted to handle southbound I-65 traffic. Spaghetti Junction would be transformed into a giant flying spaghetti monster of 23 lanes, with all of its noodles straightened to allow traffic along Louisville's 3 interstates to flow smoothly through the city. Its construction would eviscerate parts of Butchertown, another of Louisville's oldest and most established working-class neighborhoods. It was estimated that the Ohio River Bridges project would cost $2.5 billion, but it didn't take long for the price tag to balloon to $4.1 billion. It became one of the largest public works projects in the United States. The Bridges project was all about big numbers. The new plans were met with immediate opposition from a local organization called Riverfields. They were ostensibly a nonprofit conservation group, but their charter became the preservation of territory that just happened to be in Louisville's wealthiest backyards. Part of that preservation meant stopping I-265's eastern bridge from ever being built. They lobbied for construction of only the new downtown bridge and a redesign of Spaghetti Junction. An eastern bridge wasn't needed, they said. But another group took the opposite view. Build the eastern bridge, this group argued, and then eliminate I-64 from Louisville's riverfront. Open the area for development. Don't build another downtown bridge. Simplify Spaghetti Junction instead of expanding it. Make transit traffic go around the city, not through it. This group called themselves 8664. I'd read a little about 8664 in the Courier-Journal, which took a dim view of their ideas. The Bridges project was a major topic of conversation around town, so I decided to study it in more detail. On the 8664 website, I found images of a restored and beautiful riverfront, liberated from the ugly elevated highway that scarred it. Those images contrasted sharply with the pictures generated by the Bridges project with its frightening giant flying spaghetti monster redesign. These 8664 guys were on to something, I decided, so I called one of the group's co-founders, Tyler Allen. I was running for Congress, I told him, and I wanted to know more about what they were up to. Could we get together and talk? Sure, he told me, only he was out of town. He'd be back in time for the next Metro Democratic Club meeting, and he'd meet me there. The meeting was going to be held as a candidate fair so that we could all stand next to tables, sell ourselves to voters, and hawk our wares. Hawk our wares. Shit. I realized that I still didn't have any wares. I at least needed to get some bumper stickers, didn't I? Every candidate has bumper stickers, don't they? And I needed a slogan, something catchy. I'd been reading a lot about a group called Citizens United who'd beaten up on Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11 in 2004 because they said that its publicity amounted to political advertising. The whole money and politics thing and its corruptive influence both fascinated and disgusted me, like it does most of us, so I decided to make it the main theme of my Tilting at Windmills campaign. I'd beat up on the lobbyists, I decided. I'd call my campaign Exile on K Street. I don't get it, a friend told me. It doesn't make any sense. Sure it does, I countered. You know, the Rolling Stones. Exile on Main Street. Lobbyists. K Street. D.C. We're all in exile there. Maybe I'll rip off the Stones Lips logo and put it on my stickers. Now that I was trying to verbalize it, it wasn't making much sense to me either. But I decided to go with it anyway. You're a Democrat, another guy told me. Make sure that all your stuff is printed at a union shop. Everything has to have a union label on it. I hadn't thought of that. Unions. I needed to think about that. I had a lot of conflicted feelings about unions. I remembered my father coming home from work during General Electric's negotiations with the IUE, the union that represented appliance assembly workers. He always looked shell-shocked. He told me that once during negotiations, a union guy climbed into the rafters in one of General Electric's factories and he dumped a bucket of some kind of sludgy industrial grossness onto a manager as he walked by. The manager was pretty messed up as a result. Everybody I'd ever known who'd been in negotiations with a union has come out of those meetings looking as though they wanted to kill somebody, or themselves. Dealing with unions could be a tough, nasty business. Once while I was working at McDonnell Douglas in St. Louis, a union guy filed a grievance because a young guy I was working with, and who should have known better, moved a light bulb from one socket to another because he got tired of waiting for the union guy to show up and do it. The union guy, his rep, the young guy, and our boss spent most of one day in a meeting talking about that goddamned light bulb. When it was over, the union guy was awarded 4 hours of compensation. Another time I was working on a project to build a new SCIF, a secure compartmented information facility. SCIFs are like bank vaults, and they're the only places where highly classified information can be stored. We needed a fire extinguisher mounted, so I called a union guy to do it. When he showed up and asked me where to put it, I suggested a spot. I can't put it there, he told me. Why not? I asked him. Because that's wood. To drill into wood, I have to call a carpenter. No wonder, I remember thinking, that a toilet seat for an Air Force transport plane cost $600. But of course, unions weren't the only reason. McDonnell Douglas employed legions of engineers like me to work on defense projects. Sometimes we wondered amongst ourselves what the hell all these people were doing. We were part of a giant technological welfare state, we decided. Our projects were awash in money. A few billion here, a few billion there. We were the military-industrial complex that Dwight Eisenhower had warned us about in his farewell speech. Naturally, my own experiences with unions were merely anecdotal. Unions were far from perfect, but there's a case to be made that they helped to create the middle class. Could entities be trusted to treat their employees fairly and pay them a livable wage? Sometimes. But all too often they could not. Without unions, the disparity between executive pay and that of frontline workers would be even worse than it is. Sure, my union-made paraphernalia was going to cost a little more than the cheap mail-order crap that I could get, but what the hell, I wasn't going to print much stuff anyway. By the time I got around to ordering bumper stickers and yard signs, I'd decided to self-finance my campaign. A couple of rich doctor friends and a few other not-so-rich friends offered to kick in and help, but I just didn't have the heart to take their money. I knew that my campaign wasn't going anywhere, and I couldn't bring myself to ask them to invest in a lost cause. Besides, I was too lazy to fill out the FEC paperwork. The guy who was now the president of the Metro Democratic Club, Bruce Maples, convinced me to swear off PAC money. That would be easy, I told him, since I'd decided to swear off all money. At least until I won the primary, I said. I kept telling people that I wasn't going to raise money until after the primary. But how were you going to beat Ann Northup without raising any money, people kept asking. I told them again that I would raise it after the primary. But how are you going to beat Ann Northup, they'd ask again. I realized that I'd screwed up. I'd delivered a message and then I tried to clarify that message. But no one was listening. Tyler Allen introduced me to J.C. Stites, the other co-founder of 8664. I started hanging out with the 8664 crowd, and that included a bunch of urban planners. I realized that I liked what they were doing. I met Patrick Piuma, who ran a place in downtown Louisville called the Urban Design Studio. He showed me some aerial photographs of the city, and he pointed out the inner city's Swiss cheese patchwork of empty lots, a clear sign of urban decay. Another guy, a real estate developer named Gant Hill, took me on a tour of some downtown development projects. We paused in front of a parking lot. This is what happens in a distressed city, he told me. Speculators buy a property, tear down whatever's on it, and then turn it into a parking lot. That way they'll generate at least some revenue while they're waiting for the surrounding neighborhood to bounce back. What Patrick and Gant showed me gave me pause. Louisville had way too many parking lots. I had never looked at my hometown that way before. Typical engineer. That was Patrick again critiquing my shiny new yard signs. Your name is way too small, he said. I'd printed bumper stickers and yard signs with 3 horizontal stripes of red, white, and blue. Each stripe had a line of text on it. James Moore for Congress, exile on K Street, www.voteforjimmy.org. I have a boring name, and there are tens of thousands of James Moores running around the USA. I had to go with a .org domain because some other James Moore had already grabbed the .com version. Some guy in Keokuk, Iowa, I like to joke, although I had no real idea where he was. And I decided that Jimmy sounded catchier than James. It had worked for Jimmy Carter, and that's what my mother had called me when I was a kid anyway. I'd left off the lips. I was sure that the Stones wouldn't have given a damn if I'd used them, but they were going to be too expensive. Patrick was right. Everything was way too small. From a few feet away you couldn't read any of it. At least my yard signs looked like Remax for sale signs. Maybe people who were out house hunting would slow down long enough to look at them. I started going to more candidate forums, lots and lots of candidate forums, and meeting with groups, lots and lots of groups. The Petersburg-Newburgh Improvement Association, the Young Professionals Association, the Oakdale Neighborhood Association, the Louisville Coalition of Neighborhoods, the Louisville African American Think Tank. Drinking liberally, they always met at a bar. At one forum run by a group called America 2000, I met Burl for the first time. The place was packed, probably because there was lots of free food, and most of it was quite good, especially when measured against the standard fare that most events offered, if they offered anything at all. Enid Redmond, yet another buddy from the Metro Democratic Club, ran the local chapter of America 2000, and she knew how to draw a crowd. The presence of all those America 2000 bodies made the place hot as hell. In the midst of all that humanity, Burl was still easy to spot because he was a big guy, almost as tall as me, but a lot bulkier. I walked up to him and introduced myself, and I told him that he was the smartest guy in the room because he was the only one with enough sense to wear shorts. I still can't see pictures of John Fetterman without thinking about good old Burl. We had a nice conversation, mostly about issues, and I found that he didn't appear to be as debilitated as I'd expected he would be. I could tell that he had a brilliant mind. When it was time to go, I told him that I'd see him around. "You're Thomas Paine," he said. Some of the candidate forums were well attended, but many were not. Mike Bailey from Democracy for America showed up to most of them, and he started a running joke with his head counts. 30 candidates and 5 civilians, he'd say, and often that's the way that it was. Kentucky is one of those states that requires its judges to be elected, and every few cycles they come out of the ground like cicadas, and they swarm onto ballots in overwhelming numbers. State Supreme Court judges, Court of Appeals judges, circuit judges for family court judges, circuit judges for judicial circuit judges, district judges, boatloads of judges. In 2006, one of the larger populations of judges hatched, and at our candidate forums they all milled around like me, waiting for their turn to talk to voters. Primary elections were round 1 for these nonpartisan races. If multiple candidates wanted to be a judge, the primary whittled the crowd down to just the top 2, and they ran off against each other in November. I got to gab with a lot of judicial candidates, and we all became buddies. My favorite was Susan Gibson, who was making her first run for office. She wanted to be a circuit judge. Susan was bright and pleasant, and her acid sense of humor appealed to me. She's cool, I remember telling myself. I want to be her friend. And fortunately for me, I now am. The Northup campaign always sent spies to our forums to do some Oppo research. Usually they just sat in the back and filmed us. Sometimes their operatives lurked around us and tried to eavesdrop on our conversations. It wasn't long before we all knew who they were. At one forum run by CART, the Coalition for the Advancement of Regional Transportation, Carolyn told me that I made a bunch of silly faces and that the Northup people had gotten it all on video. "God help you if you win," she told me. "These people will have a field day with that footage." I tried to rationalize that I was just a decoy. While they were filming my silly faces, I told her, they probably weren't filming Yarmouth. Carolyn wasn't buying it. "Do better," she said. I promised that I would try. By this time, I'd become pretty good buddies with Andrew Horn and his wife Stephanie. I liked them both. Stephanie was a real political junkie, and it was fun to trade notes with her about how they were going to beat Ann Northup. We, of course, to her meant Andrew. She sincerely believed that he was going to win the primary. I was just as sure that he wouldn't, but I didn't say anything. There wasn't any point. I started hanging out with Dan Borsch, who was John Yarmouth's campaign manager. Dan's a great guy, and we all got along well. After a lot of our events, a few of us would repair to a local bar somewhere, knock back a couple of beers, and shoot the shit. It was a lot of fun. After a few more 30-candidate 5-civilian forums, I realized that I needed to amp up my voter outreach if I was going to make a credible show of this candidacy thing. But without an advertising budget, I didn't have many choices. There was a local social network called Louisville Mojo, and I set up an account there. Mojo's structure was similar to MySpace, the biggest social network in those ancient days that were 2006. MySpace annoyed the hell out of me, but I set up an account there anyway. Maybe I can use these networks to reach a lot of people for free, I thought. But I knew that it wasn't going to be enough. I needed to get on the radio. But not just any radio. I needed to get on WHAS talk radio. WHAS 840 AM is the oldest radio station in Kentucky and one of the oldest in the United States. When I was a kid growing up in Louisville, WHAS radio and television were parts of a media empire owned by the Bingham family, who were the closest thing to royalty that an American city could produce. At the end of World War I, Robert Worth Bingham used money that he inherited from the Standard Oil fortune to purchase the Courier-Journal and the Louisville Times from Henry Watterson. He expanded his empire with WHAS radio in 1922, and then his son Barry Bingham added WHAS television in 1950. Barry turned the enterprise into a local media juggernaut. He was Louisville's Rupert Murdoch, but with one major difference. Barry Bingham had a conscience. The Bingham newspapers were considered among the best in the nation, and it was because of them that I'd become a news junkie. My parents and I read the Courier-Journal every morning, from the headlines to the classifieds, and then we did the same thing in the evening with the Louisville Times. A lot of us did. WHAS 840 AM is one of only a handful of high-powered clear-channel radio stations in the U.S. whose broadcasts are protected from interference by other stations, no matter their distance. At night, WHAS 840 AM radio can be heard across the entire continent. The story of the Bingham family is unfortunately rife with sadness. By most accounts, Robert Worth Bingham's first wife committed suicide by throwing herself in front of a train, Anna Karenina style. 2 of his grandsons eventually died in freak accidents, and infighting among the members of the Bingham clan resulted in the breakup and sale of their media empire in the 1980s. Carolyn and I used to cross paths with Barry Bingham Jr. a lot. We all spent a lot of time at Actors Theater of Louisville, one of the best live performance regional theaters in the United States. Barry Jr. was the only surviving grandson of Robert Worth Bingham, and he was the last editor of the independent Courier-Journal and the Louisville Times. But his father got tired of the family bickering, and he threw Jr. under the bus and sold the papers to Gannett, the largest mass media holding company in the country. Whenever we saw him, Barry Jr. always looked tentative and sad. Scads of books and articles have been written about the Binghams. Diane Sawyer produced a 60 Minutes piece about them. Vanity Fair called the Binghams the Kennedys of Inner America. By the time of our campaign, WHAS Radio was owned by Clear Channel Communications, another giant media company. They owned hundreds of radio and TV stations around the U.S. Most of WHAS talk show content was still locally produced, and I started making as much noise as I could to get on their shows. The mornings with Francine Cuccinello, afternoons with Terry Miners, nights with Joe Elliott, and Sundays with Denton Randall. I scored my first success with Francine. She had a reputation for being tough on local Pauls, but she also had a soft spot for underdogs, and I certainly qualified as one of those. The WHAS radio studio was housed in a squat, ugly concrete building in the suburban Newburgh neighborhood, not far from General Electric's Appliance Park. The inside of the studio was beautiful, though, at least it was to me. The broadcast booth where I sat with Francine was brightly lit and surrounded by glass and gear that fascinated the electrical engineer in me. It made me wonder if maybe I shouldn't have tried a career in broadcasting. But that was just another road that I'd never taken. On the air, I told Francine how odd it felt hearing content for another station, WAVG, being broadcast on WHAS. When I was a kid, WAVG had a different call sign, WAVE, and in those days it was WHAS's rival. But the era of locally owned independent broadcast stations was long gone. During our interview, I raged about globalization. I raged about the stupid war. Francine asked me about education, and I talked about school choice, about how difficult it was for a West End kid to go to an East End school if that's what the kid wanted to do, because it was too hard to get there. Our transportation system was terrible, I said, although it wasn't the fault of TARC, our local bus system. They were doing the best they could with what they had, I said, but what they had wasn't enough. I'd intended to use the transportation angle as a segue to start talking about 8664, but we ran out of time. Francine told me that she really liked my website, voteforjimmy.org. I'd thrown it together in just a few hours, and it was pretty basic, but it showed who I was. This is me, the website said, and these are the issues, and this is where I stand. If you like what you see, then please consider voting for me, and if you don't, well, then go vote for somebody else. I'll get over it. I said that on the air. It felt good to say that. You're a very dangerous candidate, a guy I knew told me, because you don't give a damn. You've got nothing to lose, so you can just say whatever the hell you want. And he was right. I was going to lose, and so of course I had nothing more to lose by saying whatever was on my mind. The guy was a Republican, and he was very conservative, but he was also very intelligent. He was fascinated by what we Democrats were doing. A lot of Republicans were fascinated by what we were doing. I disagree with you on almost every issue, they'd tell me, but I really admire what you're trying to accomplish here. Some of them even wanted to volunteer. Maybe only to help me sabotage John Yarmouth, I thought. But there was an energy amongst us Democrats, and it was fun to watch. In the Northup campaign, there was nothing to watch. At least there was nothing yet. In the middle of March, I managed to get myself booked on the Denton Randall Radio Sunday show, but we were preempted. The University of Kentucky had advanced to play UConn in the NCAA basketball tournament. WHAS 840 had long been the voice of the Wildcats. It was the station that my father and I tuned in to hear Cawood Ledford, WHAS sports broadcasting legend, call UK's games. Maybe it was psychological imprinting, but I've never heard a radio announcer who could call a basketball game quite like Cawood Ledford could. With his words, he painted pictures of a basketball game that were better than anything you could see on TV. It's a lost art. Even when we watched Kentucky games on TV, my father would turn down the sound and tune in Cawood on the radio. When my interview with Denton Randall was postponed, I understood. In the big dance that weekend, UConn beat Kentucky, and so I was rebooked with Denton for the following Sunday. When the morning of my interview rolled around, I got a call from Denton's producer. They'd had a cancellation, and could I come in early? Sure, I told him, so I rushed off to the studio. By now I knew what to expect, and I felt more at ease in the sound booth, and Denton put me at ease. He's an affable and avuncular guy, and we got along well. Denton had read my website too, and he liked what he saw. It seemed to him as though I had a bit of a libertarian bent. Was that a fair characterization? It was, I told him. I was a live and let live kind of guy. Then we started talking about Mitch McConnell. He'd just penned an op-ed where he championed the use of big money in political advertising. That was the exercise of free speech, McConnell said. I called bullshit. Free speech wasn't free anymore, I said. You had to pay for it. You had to pay to be heard. Money is the death of free speech, I said. Death by drowning. It felt good to say that. Because of the extra time slot, I was on the air for an hour, and we had time to take some calls from listeners. The first guy wanted to beat up on me about abortion. Ann Northup is pro-life, the guy said. Democrat and Catholic Romano Mazzoli was pro-life. He'd even tried to push a constitutional amendment that would have granted legal protection to all unborn children. Didn't I think that it was dangerous to come out as pro-choice, the guy asked, in a place like heavily Catholic Louisville? Danger doesn't scare me, I told him. I say what I think. I say what I feel. If you don't agree with me, that's fine. Go vote for somebody else, I said. Take me or leave me. I'm pro-choice. It felt good to say that, too. I raged again about money. No way that any of us are going to be able to match Ann Northup's war chest, I said. We're going to have to figure out some other way to beat her. I tried to promote myself as the guy with the best crossover appeal. The hour went by in a hurry, and I left the studio full of adrenaline. This shit's pretty cool, I thought to myself. Even though I was a little leery of them, I started meeting with unions. the Central Louisville Labor Council, the United Auto Workers, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, all kinds of workers. Some of them had heard me raging about globalization on the radio, and they liked what they heard. There was no way that any of the unions were going to endorse me over John Yarmouth, but I was naive enough to think that some of their members might vote for me anyway. There are 2 huge Ford assembly plants in Louisville, and their UAW education rep decided that I was her kind of libertarian. Every time I saw her, she tried to dump a bunch of Lyndon LaRouche literature on me. Jesus, I thought to myself, do I sound like that guy? I got to be buddies with a rep from one of the electrical workers locals, and once in a while we'd grab a beer. We didn't talk much about politics or his union activities, except when he told me that the shop where he worked wasn't very good at enforcing safety rules. His union's enforcement was the only thing that kept him from getting fried, he said. That made an impression on me. When we did get around to talking about my campaign, he said, "Man, you're swinging for the fence in your first at-bat." That's exactly what I was doing, I told him, and I knew that it was going to be a swing and a miss. I made it back on the radio, this time with Joe Elliott. He was a tougher sell. I'd been bugging his producer for over a month, and he kept saying that he would get back to me after we get basketball out of the way. Finally, Elliott called me. On the phone, he grilled me hard on the issues. I have to vet indie candidates before I put them on the air, he said. I had one guy start crying on me. I'm not gonna cry, I told him. Elliott's show ran from 9 to midnight. It was a time slot when the entire country could tune in WHAS if they wanted to. It was dark and the studio was nearly deserted when I arrived, and it was Joe who met me at the door. Joe was blind, but he knew every step and turn that he needed to take to navigate from the front door to his chair in the studio. On the way, he paused at the coffee machine. "Want some?" he asked. "No thanks," I said. He grabbed a cup and led me into the booth. I was fascinated by the adaptive technology that he was using. A critical tool for a radio announcer is the countdown counter. Each on-air segment is carefully timed, as are the commercial breaks. When I sat in the booth with Joe, the LED countdown counter was supplemented by one in Braille. Joe kept his hand on it while we talked. He listened to rapid-fire text-to-speech messages during breaks. It was impressive. Unlike Francine and Denton, Joe was more formal and businesslike. That was just his style. Most of the hour was rapid-fire Q&A about issues, and there wasn't much of the easygoing banter that I'd gotten used to with his radio colleagues. Elliott pushed the limits of my knowledge, and one time he had to coach me on the details of some piece of legislation that I wasn't familiar with. And I could tell that he disagreed with me most of the time. If I was at all a libertarian, it was with a very small L. Joe spelled libertarian with a very big L. But he was very much with me on the issue of campaign finance reform. On the drive home from the studio, I listened to part of his second hour. "I like this Jim Moore guy," Joe said. "He's not afraid to say what he thinks. I disagree with a lot of what he says, and he's got zero chance to win, but I like him." I thought about calling back into his show to argue with him some more, but I was tired as hell, and the next day was going to be big. The next day was going to be the Mastersons debate. Masterson's was another of Louisville's old institutions. It was a big restaurant that had been around town for more than half a century. It had a banquet hall that could hold 400 people. It sat at the edge of the campus of the University of Louisville, not far from downtown. Virginia Woodward, who was the head of the Louisville Democratic Party, booked Masterson's and announced that there would be a Democratic congressional debate. It was going to be televised. It was going to be a very big deal. It was chilly when I got to the restaurant, and I spotted Burl standing outside the entrance under a portico. He was wearing shorts again. "Aren't you cold?" I asked him. "Scotland's cold, and they wear kilts," Burl said, "and they don't wear any underwear." I was beginning to love this guy. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, what the hell have I gotten myself into? The little voice inside my head was frantic. The banquet hall was huge, really huge, and it was filling up with people. Lots and lots of people. And journalists, print journalists, radio journalists, TV journalists. Lots and lots of journalists. I went into the restroom. By some miracle, no one else was there. I stood at the mirror, and to distract myself, I thought about another scene from the movie Patton. The one where he's about to do battle with Rommel for the first time, and he stands at a mirror after he's gotten dressed, and he says to himself, "All my life I've wanted to lead a bunch of men in a desperate battle. Now I'm going to do it." I tried repeating those lines in front of the restroom mirror. They didn't help. I wandered back into the banquet hall. It was getting very full, but I found a section that still had some empty chairs, and I sat in one. I took out my little MP3 player, put on my headphones, and I started flipping through songs. No, 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 yes, The Crying Game. The Boy George version, of course. The little metallic bass guitar riff, the hook at the beginning of the song, caught me. It was what I needed, I thought. And I'd loved the movie. We all did, didn't we? The troubles, the emotional conflict, the doing what had to be done, all of that rot. One day soon, I'm gonna tell the moon about the crying game, and if he knows, maybe he'll explain. I played that damn song over and over on a continuous loop, like I was a basketball star psyching myself up to play in the national championship, or the semifinal at least. Like I was a prize fighter getting ready to box for the heavyweight title, only I wasn't a heavyweight. And I was pretty sure that I was about to get the shit beat out of me. I felt a tap on my shoulder. I lifted my headphones. It was time to go. I climbed up onto the stage, and somebody told me that my lectern was all the way to the right, stage left. I looked at the other guys standing to my right at the other 3 podiums. They looked like they were 1,000,000 miles away. I looked at the crowd. By now the banquet hall was packed. People were standing in the back and overflowing into the hallways. They all had anxious faces. They looked at us like they were desperate to be saved, and we were the only ones who could save them. I had never seen anything like it. At least I'd never seen anything like it while standing at a podium. The TV cameras lit up. The lights blinded me. They froze me like I was a deer in some monstrous headlights. A local TV reporter lady was seated just below me, off to my left. There were a bunch of local journalists and a sort of a media mosh pit just below the stage, but this TV lady stood out. She was staring straight at me. She scared the hell out of me. She had that too serious local TV reporter look on her face, like so many of them have, but somehow hers was more severe. And it wasn't a resting bitch face. It was more like a murder in cold blood face. She was staring me down. She was telepathic. Her silent voice was bypassing my ears and whispering directly into my brain. It said, "I am going to kill you." I was relieved when I found out that Murder in Cold Blood Face wasn't going to be asking any questions. But directly in front of me sat another local TV lady. She was going to be asking questions. She looked scarier than the other one, and her silent voice was more explicit. "Not only am I going to kill you," it said, "I am going to chop you up into little pieces and feed you to my cat." I could see Carolyn in the front row. Sitting next to her was Jennifer, my old friend from engineering school. We were also old family friends. Her aunt and my mother had worked together at General Electric. That was 1,000,000 years ago. I could read the expressions on their faces. "We love you," they both said, "and we're sorry that you have to die." Our MC was Denton Randall. His presence calmed me a bit. I really liked Denton. He started things off with a Mark Twain quote and something about democracy with a capital D. "An honest man in politics shines more than he would elsewhere," Denton quoted Twain. He should have used, "Fleas can be taught nearly anything that a congressman can." The questions started. What about the war? What about North Korea? Kim Jong-il was making noise about blowing us up. "Just saber-rattling," I said. "What about Social Security? Gonna have to raise the minimum retirement age and the income cap on contributions," I said. "It's not what anyone wants, but it's what all the think tanks say that we have to do." I said something about tort reform. "The U.S. had too many lawyers," I said. Pilots hated lawyers. Once some guy got drunk and piled into an old Cessna with 3 of his friends. His seat wasn't latched right, and on takeoff it slid. The guy lost control. They crashed and everybody died. The families sued. It was the seat tracks, they said. They won millions. Cessna said, "That's it. If some guy is going to crash a little airplane that we made 40 years ago and then sue us for millions and win, we're just not going to make little airplanes anymore." And they didn't for about 30 years until some limited tort reform was passed. All of us pilots were pissed off. We'd all had seats slide on us like that, but it was no big deal. Unless you were drunk. I didn't have time to say anything about the Cessnas, but I said that we should kill all the lawyers, or something like that. The debate flew by. It was only an hour. The journalists in front took turns asking us questions, and we took turns answering them. Finally, it was time for a TV cat lady to ask a question, and it was my turn to answer. She looked straight at me. "What about the bridges?" she said. "We can't even paint the Kennedy Bridge, so how the hell are we going to build 2 new bridges?" she wanted to know. The old I-65 Kennedy Bridge was getting pretty rusty, and a contract had been let to repaint it. The contractors got about halfway done, and then they went bankrupt and disappeared. I thought for a fraction of a second. To hell with it, I decided. And then I made the mother of all clumsy segues. "I have one word for you," I said. 8664. I started raging against the Bridges project. "Get that interstate off of our waterfront," I said. "Why the hell do we want to pave over our city with highways?" It felt good to say that. None of the other guys would. It was time for our closing statements. "Who's given you the most direct answers?" I asked. "Who tells you the truth instead of what you want to hear? Who do you think is the most qualified for this job?" I tossed in a dramatic pause. And then I asked, "Now, who has the most money?" There was an audible gasp from the audience. I felt all satisfied. I thought that I'd just driven home my point about campaign finance reform. I was a stupid idiot. I'd just insulted John Yarmouth. When it was over, I wandered down into the audience. I was in a daze. A guy in a fedora came up to me. "You won," he said. "I what?" I asked. "You won," he said again. I won. What the hell did that mean? I was so full of adrenaline and energy that I couldn't process anything that anyone was saying. I just paced around the floor. There was no way that I could sit down. I'd never felt anything like this before. I felt like letting out a war whoop. Maybe I did. A couple of lawyers walked up and told me that they wanted to volunteer, Karen and Julie. They were partners in their own practice. They'd come to the debate hoping to decide between Yarmouth and Horn, they said, but they left deciding that they were going to vote for me. "Even though I said that I wanted to kill you?" I asked. "Even then," they answered. A bunch of us went to a bar. I made a complete ass of myself. Only I wasn't drunk, I was stoned. On politics. The campaign had become my drug, and it was giving me a high that I couldn't handle. The next day, David Hopp, the Courier-Journal editor who was 8664's chief antagonist, wrote that I stole the show, but then he went after me for my positions on 8664 and campaign finance reform. He wrote that I took the Masterson's crowd to the line that separates the serious from the naive and dippy. I didn't care. I got a couple of offers of professional management. I told them that I hadn't raised any money. "Start," they said. "Do I really have a chance?" I asked one of them. "You have a chance," he said. "Those other campaigns are running on fumes." I started to believe him. I understood now how Stephanie Horn could believe in Andrew's chances. I called up the Kentucky Democratic Party and asked them if they could get me some voter data. They sent me a bunch of clumsy comma-delimited text files. I was a geek for a living, so I sucked the files into an SQL database and I started running queries to look for people who'd voted in at least 4 of the last 5 Democratic primaries. Maybe I can reach enough of them, I thought. Maybe I can really do this. I held a couple of campaign volunteer meetings. Is anybody here still in college? Do any of you have an account on this Facebook thing? In 2006, people still needed a .edu email address to join, but nobody in our group had ever messed with it. The adrenaline high of the Mastersons debate eventually wore off, but I was still energized. Some of the Horn people wanted me to drop out. They started sniping at me on bluegrassreport.org, a political blog run by a guy named Mark Nicholas. In those days, it was the place where most of the Kentucky Democratic cognoscenti hung out to prattle about politics. Some of the Horn supporters pointed out that I'd made an ass of myself after the Mastersons debate. They were right. Andrew Horn invited me to lunch. He asked me to drop out. He was afraid that I'd play the role of spoiler. No, I told him I wanted to tough this thing out all the way to the end. He respected that, he said. Denton Randall started providing encouragement. We were becoming friends, and after the debate we started hanging out once in a while. "Stop saying if you win," he'd tell me. "Start saying when you win." I told him that I couldn't say that. It just wasn't me. After my stints on WHAS radio, I started getting lots of mail. Snail mail and email. I'd already been getting a lot of questionnaires from groups that wanted to know my positions on issues. There was the National Rifle Association Victory Fund, of course. They wanted to know how I felt about assault rifles and armor-piercing ammunition. The Gun Owners of America wanted to know if it was fair to prohibit a guy from getting a gun just because he'd twisted his wife's arm in an argument. Jesus, I thought, that guy had issues. There was the National Taxpayers Union, the Greater Louisville Central Labor Council, the League of Women Voters, the Kentucky Women's Political Caucus, and there was the National Right to Life Association. They wanted to make sure that I knew about the capacity of unborn babies to feel pain. I learned later that almost all organizations send different questionnaires to Democrats than they do to Republicans. Burl started calling me a lot. His greeting on the phone was always, "Candidate Moore." Our conversations were usually pretty one-sided. After I answered, he'd launch into a stream of segues and non-sequiturs about whatever was on his mind. I just let him talk. It was fun. He was randomly brilliant. He may have been bent, but he wasn't broken, and my conversations with him were always interesting. It was obvious that he was very well read. I started looking forward to his calls, and I really became fond of him. I felt the camaraderie between us. We were the other guys, and in almost every call he told me that I was Thomas Paine. That always made me feel a little guilty because it reminded me that I'd never bothered to read more than a few paragraphs of common sense. After I said that I was pro-choice on Denton's show, I started getting postcards. Dozens of them, all handwritten in elegant cursive. Abortion is a sin, they all said. Think about the babies, they said. It was obvious that they'd all been written by women. The handwriting was too graceful for a man to have done any of them. I couldn't help but wonder what all those women thought while they were sitting around a table writing postcards to a minor candidate like me. And even though I disagreed with them, I admired them for doing it. This was quiet democracy, I told myself. I still have all of their postcards in a box somewhere. I got a few anxious phone calls and emails. "My wife has cancer," one guy wrote. "We lost our health insurance. I lost my job. Now we've maxed out all our credit cards. Help us, please." I never knew what to tell people like him. I wasn't going to be elected to Congress, and there was no way that I could help them even if I had been. But they were desperate, and they had nowhere else to turn, so they turned to me. I kept meeting with groups, lots and lots of groups. I even met with a group called the College Republicans. Their leader was a quiet, self-effaced young woman, and I can still remember how downcast she looked. I don't think that it was because she was a Republican. I think that it was simply because she was a sad young woman. She invited me to say a few words, and I talked about how much I regretted the divide between us, and shouldn't we spend more time figuring out how we could all work together? Then some low-level official from the Kentucky Republican Party showed up. He hadn't heard me speak, and he didn't know who I was. I couldn't fault him for that. Most people didn't know who I was. He said that he wouldn't be happy until every last Democrat had been driven out of Kentucky. And then his face broke into an evil grin. There were more forums. At one of them, Mike Ward, the former congressman, asked me if I was serious about our campaign. "I'm very serious," I told him. I meant it. At least I told myself that I did. I'd started interpolating between the 0 chance that Joe Elliott gave me and the "you have a chance" odds that I'd been assigned by the political consultants who talked to me after the Masterson's debate. The number that I came up with wasn't very big, but I managed to convince myself that it was no longer 0. I decided that I'd sprint to the finish as fast as I could, but I still wasn't going to take any money from anybody, not one red cent. One forum was about nuclear proliferation. It was in another big auditorium that held a few hundred people, and once again the place was packed. But the atmosphere was a lot more relaxed than it had been at the Masterson's debate. The room was airy and sunny, and instead of standing at podiums, we were all seated at tables. There was something about sitting instead of standing that changed the entire personality of an event, for me at least. When I was seated, I found that I could relax and put myself at ease. When I had to stand, I got all sweaty and nervous. At this forum, the crowd was somber and silent, and there was very little press. Murder and Cold Bloodface and TV Cat Lady were nowhere to be found. In 2006, there were almost 26,000 nuclear warheads scattered around the planet. What happens if a terrorist organization gets hold of one, the forum wanted to know. I felt all smug and satisfied. After all, I was the guy who'd worked on nuclear weapons. I had a leg up on the other guys. But of course I didn't have any answers, and the forum topic bothered me. It forced me to be a little introspective. All those years ago I'd wanted to work on airplanes, and instead I'd ended up working on a torpedo. A flying torpedo with a very big bomb in it. I'd spent 13 years working on that damn thing, and I'd been nothing more than a small redundant cog in a very big machine. What a waste. The old song came back to haunt me. Of course it did, like it had at least 100 times since I'd done what I'd done. This old man, he played 3. He played knick-knack on my knee with a knick-knack paddywhack, give a dog a bone. This old man came rolling home. This old man, he played 4. Shh.